Lonely rancher buys abandoned ranch, but he found a girl who grew up with wolves. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The Texas Panhandle stretched wide and silent beneath the early light, a land painted in faded gold and stubborn gray. John Carter leaned against the porch rail of his weather-worn ranch house, his hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had long since cooled. He breathed in the air, clean, sharp, and absent of the noise of towns or gunfire. After years of carrying the weight of battlefields and broken promises, this quiet felt almost holy. The fence line that marked the edge of his land stood like weary sentinels, crooked posts scarred by wind and time. Beyond them, the prairie rolled on without end, dotted with live oaks and mesquite, and in that vastness John thought, perhaps, he could finally disappear. Men who had seen what he had seen seldom spoke of peace, but they hungered for it just the same. On the porch table rested a small leather Bible, its spine cracked, its pages thin as onion skin. His mother's handwriting lingered on the inside cover, "Be still and know that I am God." The words had carried him through long nights in muddy trenches and through days when smoke blotted out the sun. Now, in this lonely place, they whispered of a new beginning. He sipped from his mug, watching a hawk wheel lazily above the valley. For a fleeting moment, John allowed himself to believe that this land, so empty and unyielding, might heal him. He had no family left, no reason to ride into town except for supplies, and no one expecting his return. Perhaps that was enough. But then, movement. It was only a flicker at the edge of the tree line, a shadow slipping between the trunks. John narrowed his eyes. Too small for a man, too quick for a deer. He set the cup down and straightened, the old boards of the porch creaking under his boots. The shape emerged again, this time into the clearing where sunlight brushed against tall grass. His breath caught in his throat. It was a girl, no more than 18, slender as a willow switch, yet there was nothing ordinary about her. Dark hair hung tangled around her shoulders, her clothes no more than rags clinging to her thin frame. She moved with a crouched, feral grace, every step silent as though she had spent her life among creatures that never walked upright. She froze when she noticed him, lifting her head in sudden alarm. For a long moment, the two of them stared across the open ground, 50 yards of silence between them. Her eyes held intelligence, yes, but also a wildness that prickled the back of John's neck. He raised one hand slowly, palm out, the same gesture he had once used to calm frightened horses. "Easy," he murmured, though he doubted she could understand. "I won't hurt you." The girl tilted her head at the sound of his voice. Curiosity flickered across her face, gone almost as quickly as it came. Then a low growl carried from the woods behind her, deep, menacing, the kind of sound that stirred old instincts. Her body stiffened, and before John could take another step, she vanished back into the trees as if she had never been there at all. The prairie fell quiet again, but John knew in that instant that his solitude had been broken. Whatever story she carried with her, it had now become part of his. John lingered at the edge of the porch, listening. The growl that had sent the girl fleeing still echoed faintly in his ears, though now the woods had fallen silent. He glanced toward the corral where his old chestnut mare flicked her tail against the flies, unaware or unconcerned about what had passed. Animals often sensed danger before men did, yet this time she stood calm. That unsettled him more than the growl itself. He fetched his rifle from its place by the door, the walnut stock polished smooth by years of use, though he did not raise it. Habit alone guided his hand. The war had trained him to prepare for threats unseen. Yet even as his fingers brushed the cold steel, another voice rose within him, quieter but stronger. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God." His mother had read those words from Isaiah to him when he was a boy, trembling through summer storms. They steadied him now as they had then.
Still, questions crowded his mind. Who was she? What kind of life twisted a young woman into moving like a wolf through the underbrush? He remembered the scars across her arms, the way her nails caught the light like claws. But it was her eyes that lingered most. Eyes that held a spark of reason, as if humanity itself had not been entirely swallowed by wilderness. The morning passed with no further sign of her. By noon, John set to his work, mending the sagging fence line and oiling the hinges of the barn door. Yet his thoughts circled back, again and again, to the shadow that had crossed his land. He had come here to forget people, to live apart from them. But the frontier had a way of ignoring a man's intentions. The land gave what it wished, and sometimes it gave burdens. That evening, as the sky burned with crimson and purple, he sat once more on the porch with his Bible in his lap. He did not read from it this time, only traced the familiar leather with his thumb. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and the prairie wind carried scents of dust and cedar. He tried to convince himself that the girl belonged to another man's troubles, not his. But conscience does not rest easily, and John Carter had always been a man who listened to the quiet urgings of the soul. In the night, he dreamed of battlefields again, men shouting, cannons roaring, the choking haze of powder. Yet woven into that dream was the image of dark eyes watching him from across a field of grass. Eyes that seemed to ask a question he could not yet answer. When dawn came, he woke with the uneasy certainty that his life had changed. Whether he welcomed it or not, the frontier had set a new path before him. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. 3 mornings passed before John noticed the first signs. At the well, where he drew water each dawn, faint impressions marred the dust. Bare feet, small and narrow, pressed into the earth. Too light to be a man's, too deliberate to be the random wanderings of an animal. He crouched beside them, brushing his fingertips across the print. The edges were sharp, made only hours before. By the time he lifted his head, the prairie wind had begun its quiet work of erasing them. A man who wished to lie to himself could have called them tricks of the light, but John had learned long ago not to ignore what the land chose to reveal. Later that same day, he found his stores disturbed. A strip of jerky gone from the porch rail. Half a biscuit missing from the tin he had left cooling by the stove. No raccoon or coyote would have bothered to cover the crumbs with a scrap of bark, as though trying to hide the theft. That small effort told him the hand belonged to someone who understood both hunger and shame. The final sign came at dusk. He was checking the north fence when his lantern caught strange markings on the bark of an oak near the barn. Lines cut with a sharp stone, not a knife. At first glance they seemed random, the restless scratches of children. But when he leaned closer, he recognized patterns, circles within circles, jagged strokes breaking into arrow shapes. He had seen similar signs during his years on the frontier, etched into canyon walls and cliff faces. The Navajo carved them as prayers for protection. The Apache marked trails with them, warnings or blessings depending on how they were drawn. John stepped back, the lantern's glow swaying across the symbols. Whoever the girl was, she carried with her echoes of another world, one older than his ranch, older than the country itself. That night he sat long on the porch, rifle across his knees, Bible on the table beside him. He flipped it open without thinking, and his eyes fell upon the verse he had traced 100 times with a soldier's weary finger. For he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. The words from the Psalms should have steadied him, yet he wondered if angels always appeared as men imagined them, or if sometimes they came wild-eyed, scarred, and half-feral from the woods. The prairie was silent except for the restless whisper of grass. Still, he felt watched. It was not the hostile gaze of a predator, but something else, something waiting, as cautious of him as he was of it. By midnight, he knew two things with certainty. First, the girl was not a vision, not some phantom conjured by his loneliness. She was real, and she moved freely across his land. Second, the quiet life he had sought here would not remain quiet for long. Her presence was a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples had only begun to spread. By the fourth evening, John no longer doubted she was circling him. He felt it in the weight of silence, the kind that came not from emptiness, but from a presence holding its breath.
He was mending the east fence line when he caught it, the faintest movement behind a limestone boulder not 30 yards away. He kept his hammer steady, driving a nail into the weathered post. The rhythm gave him cover to steal a glance. Dark eyes stared back at him from the shadows, wide and unblinking. She was closer now, close enough for him to see the tangled fall of her hair, the way her shoulders hunched forward as if she expected a blow. John's hand tightened around the hammer, not in fear, but in caution. The war had taught him that sudden gestures could start battles no one intended. So he pretended she wasn't there, set the hammer down, and wiped the sweat from his brow as though nothing unusual troubled him. "You can come closer if you want," he said quietly, his voice pitched low, as though speaking to the skittish mare in the corral. "There's water here, and food too." The girl tilted her head. It was the same animal-like gesture he had seen before, equal parts suspicion and curiosity. She did not move. John reached into his saddlebag, slow enough for her to follow every motion. From it he drew a strip of dried venison. He held it a moment, then tossed it underhand so it landed halfway between them, rustling against the grass. The sound made her flinch, but she did not retreat. Minutes passed. John crouched beside the fence post, feigning absorption in his work. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her shift, creeping forward on hands and feet with a grace that belonged more to the forest than to the cabin. Each step was silent, deliberate, as though she had learned long ago that noise meant danger. She reached the meat and sniffed it, her nose wrinkling. Then, in one sharp motion, she tore off a piece with teeth that glinted pale in the fading light. John caught sight of scars across her arms, thin, pale reminders of old wounds. Too many for a child, too deep for accidents. He felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Whoever she was, life had carved its lessons into her flesh without mercy. Her eyes lifted to him again, meat still between her fingers. For the briefest instant, something flickered there, something beyond the wild mask. Recognition, perhaps, or the barest echo of trust. Then it was gone, shuttered behind the wary gaze of a creature who had survived too long alone. John exhaled slowly. He wanted to speak more, to ask her name, to promise she had nothing to fear here. But instinct warned him not to press. Trust was not built in a single evening, not with a soul half convinced that every hand was raised to strike. So he picked up his hammer again, set another nail, and let the silence stretch between them. It was a fragile bridge, this first exchange, but it was a bridge nonetheless. The following morning dawned with a haze of gray clouds crawling over the plains. John sat on the porch with his Bible in hand, though he had not yet opened it. The girl had not shown herself again since taking the venison, but he knew she lingered nearby. The feeling of being watched had become a constant companion, no longer threatening, but insistent, like the steady ticking of a clock. He traced the worn leather cover with his thumb. The book had survived mud, smoke, and rain, carried in his coat through battles that had torn the country in two. His mother had pressed it into his hands when he first marched off in a gray uniform, her eyes bright with both pride and fear. He had not understood then how much of her strength she had tucked between its pages. Memory came in fragments, the thunder of cannon, the smell of black powder, the cries of boys who had been men for only a day. Nights when he had huddled by a dwindling fire, this book open across his knees, searching for words that could anchor him while the world burned.
One verse had risen above the rest, steady as bedrock. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7. He had repeated it under his breath while musket balls sang overhead, while the wounded begged for mercy, while silence fell heavy after too much death. It had been a shield then. Perhaps it could be one now. John lifted his gaze toward the tree line. What kind of fear had shaped the girl out there? What darkness had pressed her into living like a wolf among the cedars? He thought of the scars along her arms, the feral crouch of her shoulders. A life like that was carved not by choice but by necessity. Fear had been her constant, and survival her only teacher. The verse whispered again in his mind, not fear, but power, love, and soundness of mind. He wondered if she had ever been given the chance to know such things. Later that day, while he mended a harness in the barn, he caught movement in the corner of his vision. She was there again, closer this time, standing half in shadow, her eyes fixed on the leather strap in his hands. For a moment, the image doubled in his mind. The frightened girl before him and the soldiers he had once seen in camp, broken, wary, hollowed out by too many wounds. He spoke without looking up. This world will teach you fear if you let it, but fear isn't the only thing there is. The words hung between them, unanswered, but he had not spoken them for her alone. They were as much for himself as for the girl. She lingered a moment longer before slipping back into the trees, silent as breath. John set the harness aside and rubbed his face with calloused hands. He had come to these plains for solitude, to bury memories that clawed at him in the night. Yet the more the girl appeared, the more those memories stirred. Perhaps God had not led him here for silence after all. Perhaps he had led him here to remember and to act. The day was hot, the kind that pressed dust into every crease of the land and left a man thirsty no matter how much water he drank. John had just finished repairing the hinges on the barn door when the distant drumming of hooves rolled across the valley. He froze, head lifted, listening. Horses, 3 of them, from the weight and rhythm. Strangers. By the time he stepped out into the yard, the riders were cresting the ridge, silhouettes against the white blaze of the sky. They came down with the swagger of men who never asked permission to enter another man's land. At the front rode a broad-shouldered figure with hair the color of gunmetal and a mustache thick as wire. He carried himself like one who had stared death down before and liked the bargain. "Afternoon," the man called, tip in his hat, though his hand lingered near the holster at his hip. "Name's Maddox, Sterling Maddox. Maybe you've heard it." John did not answer right away. His gaze blinked to the 2 younger men flanking Maddox. Both were lean, hungry-eyed, rifles strapped across their saddles. Hired guns, or worse. The kind of men who survived by violence alone. Finally, John nodded once. "Carter, this here's my place." Maddox smiled without warmth. "Fine spread you got." "Shame if it's troubled by the kind of pest we're tracking." John leaned an arm against the fence rail, careful to look calm though his chest tightened. "What kind of pest?" "The 2-legged kind." Maddox's voice carried an edge, casual but sharp as broken glass. "Been reports of a wild girl running these hills. Half human, half animal, they say. Killing cattle, spooking folks clear across the county. Some even whisper she ain't rightly human no more." John's fingers brushed the wood rail. He kept his face neutral. "I've seen no such girl." Maddox's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing about tracks, Carter, they don't lie like people do." He gestured toward the well with a tilt of his chin. "Barefoot prints, small as a woman's, leading straight onto your property." One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, restless. "Could be long gone by now, boss, maybe miles away." "Quiet, Pike," Maddox snapped, never looking away from John. "She's near. I can smell the fear on you, same as I smell dust after rain." John forced a thin smile. "What you smell is sweat." Been fixin' fences all morning." For a long moment the air hung heavy, the only sound the stampin' of hooves and the lazy buzz of flies. Then Maddox leaned forward on his saddle horn. "See, Carter, this girl ain't some lost child you can save with kindness. She's an animal, raised by beasts, acts like beasts. Last week she tore the throat out of a man's prize bull with her bare teeth. That's no fable. I saw the carcass myself." The words struck John like a hammer. He thought of the girl crouched behind the rock, scars on her arms, the faint flicker of humanity in her eyes. Whatever she was not the monster this man described. Maddox's tone hardened. "Now, I can search this place the easy way or the hard way. You choose." His hand rested openly on the revolver at his hip, and the two young guns shifted, ready. John's jaw tightened. He had faced down men with loaded muskets and cannon fire. Still, 3 against 1 was poor odds, and his rifle stood just inside the cabin door. He met Maddox's gaze without flinching. "Like I said, haven't seen a girl." The silence stretched, dangerous as a drawn bowstring. Unseen by the men in the yard, a pair of dark eyes watched from the fringe of the trees. Willa crouched low behind a tangle of mesquite, her breathing shallow, her gaze fixed on the riders who spoke with John. The moment her eyes landed on Sterling Maddox, her body stiffened. Recognition cut through her like a blade. John didn't see her there, but he felt something, an uneasy prickle along the back of his neck. He knew enough of battlefields to sense when danger pressed in from more than one side. Maddox's words rolled across the yard, smooth and practiced, but beneath them lay cruelty, coiled tight as a rattler. "We've been ridin' hard these last weeks," Maddox said, his voice carrying. "She leaves a trail of blood and ruin wherever she goes. You'd do the decent folk of this county a service by handin' her over, if you've seen her." John kept his stance loose against the fence rail, though his jaw had turned to stone. He could almost hear the girl's ragged breathing in the shadows, though the distance between them was too wide. His gut told him she was near, listening, trembling. One of the younger men, the nervous one Maddox had called Pike, shifted his weight and glanced toward the tree line. "Boss, maybe she slipped past us. Could be out of these hills by now." "Or maybe," Maddox growled, "she's hiding right under this man's nose." His eyes locked onto John's like a vice. "Tell me something straight, Carter. You the type who believes wild animals can be tamed?" John's grip tightened on the fence rail. He heard in those words more than suspicion. He heard contempt, the sneer of a man who saw weakness in kindness. "I'm the type who believes not every story told around a campfire is the truth," John replied evenly. The tension thickened. Maddox swung down from his horse with the slow confidence of a man unafraid of being shot. Dust rose around his boots as he stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the ground. "Let me be clear," Maddox said, voice low now, almost intimate. "If you're harboring her, you're not protecting a girl, you're protecting a curse. She's been marked by the wild, by wolves themselves. That makes her dangerous, to herself and to anyone fool enough to stand near her." In the brush, Willa's fingers dug into the dirt. The scars on her arms burned with memory, faces, flames, the heavy hand of men like Maddox. Her heart raced, and for the first time since she had shown herself to John, fear broke through her mask of feral calm. John couldn't see her, but he saw Maddox's smirk and knew it for what it was, the smile of a man who had already decided the ending. He straightened, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You won't find her here." Maddox studied him for a long beat, then jerked his chin at his men. "Search the sheds, search the woods, leave no stone unturned." As the rider spread out, Willa shrank back deeper into the shadows. She had survived years by vanishing, but tonight the hunters were close, too close. And in that moment, John Carter realized the truth. If he did nothing, if he stepped aside and clung to the solitude he once sought, then Maddox's men would drag her out like quarry. Whatever peace he had come here to find would be stained with her blood. The search began with the efficiency of men who had done it before. Pike and the other rider, Dalton, Maddox had called him, split off, one circling toward the barn, the other pushing into the cottonwoods along the creek.
Maddox remained by the fence, his eyes fixed on John, a predator waiting to see which way the rabbit would bolt. John kept his stance casual, but every muscle coiled tight. He forced himself to look unconcerned, even as his mind ran through calculations. 3 armed men, his rifle inside the cabin, the girl somewhere in the woods. Too many variables, too many ways this could end badly. From the trees came the sharp crack of a branch, followed by Pike's shout, "Boss, over here!" Maddox's grin was immediate, savage. He swung into the saddle and spurred his horse toward the sound. John followed on foot, boots pounding over dry earth, his stomach sinking. They found Pike kneeling near the base of a cedar, holding something aloft. It was a scrap of rough cloth, torn and frayed at the edges, smeared with dirt. The smell of smoke and sweat still clung to it. "Fresh," Pike said, his voice high with triumph. "Still warm from the sun. She was here, no doubt about it." Dalton emerged from the thicket with more proof. Faint prints in the mud by the creek, smaller than a man's, moving in haste. He jabbed the toe of his boot at them, heading north, quick and light. "She can't be far." Maddox turned in the saddle to face John, holding the scrap of cloth between 2 fingers like a trophy. "Seems your memory isn't what it used to be, Carter. Care to reconsider that story about not seeing her?" John met his gaze, forcing his features into the mask of a man unimpressed. "Could belong to anyone. Plenty of wanderers out here." "Don't insult me," Maddox's tone snapped like a whip. "That's wolf hide woven into the cloth. No civilized folk wear that. This came off her back." Behind his calm exterior, John's pulse thundered. He imagined the girl crouched somewhere in the brush, heart pounding like his own, knowing the hunters were closing in. For years he had sought solitude, believing it would save him from the world's cruelties. But solitude was no shield now. Dalton chambered a round in his rifle with a metallic click. "Orders, boss?" Maddox's eyes never left John. "We'd drive her out, box her in. If Carter wants to play dumb, let him. But if I find out he's lying—" He let the sentence trail off, his smile saying what words did not. The men fanned out again, their voices carrying across the trees. The hunt had truly begun. John stood rooted, the scrap of cloth burned into his vision. Each hoofbeat, each shout drove home the truth. The quiet life he had carved here was crumbling. The girl was no longer a passing shadow at the edge of his land. She was flesh and blood, and her fate was being decided on his soil. He turned slowly toward the cabin, the Bible still lying open on the porch table. A man could close his eyes and let the world consume itself, or he could step into the fire and choose. For John Carter, the choosing was no longer far away. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The gunshot cracked through the valley like thunder. Birds lifted from the cottonwoods in a frantic cloud, their wings beating against the silence that followed. John's heart lurched. He dropped the tool from his hand and ran, boots pounding over the brittle grass, every instinct screaming that the bullet had found its mark.
He reached the creek in a rush, breath burning in his chest. There, by the fallen trunk of a cottonwood, lay the girl. Her body was curled tight, one hand pressed hard against her shoulder. Blood seeped through her fingers, dark and steady, staining the bark beneath her. For a moment, John froze. He had seen wounds like this before, too many of them. The ragged line of torn flesh, the shallow gasps, the glassy look that came when the body began to yield. Memory surged, boys on the battlefield clutching their sides, whispering for mothers who would never come. He had sworn to leave such sights behind. Yet here it was again, written in red. The girl's eyes flickered open as his shadow fell across her. They blazed with the wildness he had seen before, teeth bared in a faint growl. But the sound faltered, turning into a trembling breath. Her lips parted. "Please." It was the first word he had ever heard from her, raw and broken, as though her voice had rusted from disuse. It struck him harder than the gunshot had. This was no beast. This was a wounded child clinging to her last thread of hope. John dropped to his knees, the earth damped beneath him. "Easy now," he said softly, reaching but not touching. "I'm here." Behind him, the thud of hooves grew louder. Maddox's men were closing in. He had only seconds. His gaze flicked from the girl's wound to the brush lining the creek. No escape that way, too much open ground. He pressed a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve against her shoulder. The girl flinched, hissed, but did not pull away. Her eyes, fierce and terrified, locked onto his. He saw in them the unspoken question. Would he hand her over or stand? "Stay with me," John whispered. "Don't you give up now." From the ridge came a shout. "She's down here!" Dalton's voice carried, sharp with triumph. John's jaw tightened. He slid himself between the girl and the sound of the riders, his body a shield. The cool weight of his revolver tugged at his hip, but he didn't draw yet. Not while her blood warmed his hand, not while her voice still echoed in his ears. The girl's grip tightened on his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes shone with pain and something more. Trust, fragile but real. For the first time, she was not a shadow slipping through trees. She was flesh, blood, and plea. And John Carter knew there was no turning back. The pounding of hooves drew closer, rattling through the creek bed. John rose to his feet, planting himself between the girl and the riders thundering down the slope. His revolver rested heavy at his side, but his hand stayed loose for now. The first line of defense was not steel, it was resolve. Dalton appeared first, rifle raised, his grin sharp with triumph. Pike followed close, nervous but eager, his eyes darting between the wounded girl and the man who shielded her. Behind them came Maddox, slower, deliberate, his presence heavy as a storm cloud. "Well, well," Maddox drawled, swinging his horse to a stop. "Looks like you've found our quarry for us, Carter. Mighty neighborly of you to bleed for the trouble." John's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes swept over the three rifles, the three hardened faces. Outnumbered, outgunned. The old instinct whispered, "Stand down, live to fight another day." But another voice rose louder, steadier, words etched into his bones since childhood. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The verse rang in his mind, not as comfort alone, but as command. Fear had ruled him too long, on battlefields, in lonely nights, even here on this land he thought would heal him. But not now, not when a life lay trembling at his feet. Dalton barked, "Step aside, Carter. She's not worth the bullet you'll take for her." John shifted slightly, widening his stance, his boots sinking into the mud of the creek bank. "You'll fire through me if you mean to reach her." His voice was calm, though his heart hammered like a war drum. Pike's rifle wavered. "Boss, maybe she's already finished. She's bleeding bad." "Quiet," Maddox snapped, his eyes locked on John. "You've lost your senses, Carter. That thing behind you, she's no girl. She's a beast. Wild as the wolves that bred her. You think she'd spare you if the roles were reversed?" John's gaze didn't falter. He thought of the word she had spoken. Fragile, trembling, but human. Please, no beast carried such a plea. "I think," John said slowly, "she's more human than the men pointing guns at her." A muscle ticked in Maddox's jaw. The sneer that spread across his face was colder than steel. "Then you've just chosen your side." For a long moment, silence gripped the creek bed. The riders shifted in their saddles, the horses stamping, the girl's ragged breath rasping behind John's shoulder. The weight of choice had fallen, and the valley held its breath to see what would follow. John squared his shoulders. Whatever came next, he would not move. The valley of shadows lay before him, but he would walk it unafraid. Maddox's laugh broke the stillness, low and cutting. "Listen to yourself, Carter. Preaching sermons in a graveyard? You think words will keep you standing when lead starts flying? You've gone soft, hiding out here with your prayers and your fences. And now you're ready to die for a mongrel?" John's hand hovered near his revolver, but he did not draw. His calm only stoked Maddox's scorn. "You know what happens to men like you," Maddox went on, voice dripping with contempt. "They get buried nameless in the dirt. The world forgets them, and the wild eats whatever scraps remain. That's the price of pity." Pike shifted uneasily in his saddle. His eyes flicked to the tree line, then back to John. Dalton spat into the dust and muttered, "Enough talk. Let's end this." He tightened his grip on the rifle, eager for violence. But then another sound threaded through the air. At first faint, a low rumble that might have been the wind stirring in the ravine. Then it grew, rolling out of the forest in a note long and mournful. A howl. Dalton stiffened. Pike swore under his breath. Maddox's smile faltered for the first time. From the shadows between the trees, eyes began to gleam. Yellow, unblinking, dozens of them. They blinked in and out of the undergrowth as shapes moved silently closer, weaving between cedar trunks and cottonwoods. Wolves. A whole pack. John's stomach knotted, though his face remained steady. He had half expected this moment ever since he first saw the girl's scars, the strange symbols carved in oak, the way her gaze seemed to reach into the wild itself. But expectation did not dull the reality of it, an army of shadows surrounding the creek bed. The horses stamped nervously, ears pinned flat, nostrils flaring. Pike pulled his rifle closer to his chest, his voice cracking. "Boss, they're not backing off, they're circling." Maddox blared at the tree line, then at John. "Tricks, that's all this is. She's trained them somehow." He spat the word like poison. "Devil's work." Behind John, Willa stirred. Her breath rasped, but her head lifted, her eyes sharpening through the pain. For the first time since the bullet struck, something fierce lit her face. The wolves pressed nearer, their paws silent on the earth. One, a massive brute with a streak of silver down its muzzle, stepped into the open, lips peeled back in a silent snarl. Maddox cursed, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Shoot one, and the rest will scatter." Dalton raised his rifle toward the silver wolf. John stepped forward, his voice cutting across the charged air. "You fire, and you won't live long enough to reload." The creek bed held its breath again, suspended on the edge of chaos. Man against man, man against beast. And at the heart of it all, a wounded girl, her eyes glinting like the wolves who had come to her call. The silence stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Dalton's rifle quivered in his grip, trained on the silver wolf. Pike's eyes darted wildly, sweat slick on his brow. Maddox sat rigid in his saddle, jaw clenched, fury warring with a shadow of unease. Behind John, Willa stirred again.
She tried to push herself upright, though blood streaked her arm and weakness dragged at her limbs. John reached back instinctively, steadying her, but she shook her head. Her eyes burned, wild and bright, fixed not on the men but on the wolves. Then she drew in a ragged breath and lifted her face to the sky. The sound that broke from her throat was like nothing John had ever heard. It was not the scream of a wounded girl, nor the cry of a trapped animal. It was a howl, clear, piercing, threaded with pain and defiance. A call that cut through the valley and echoed off the ridges. The wolves answered, first one, then another, then a chorus rising all around them. The forest came alive with their voices, rolling like thunder, filling the air with a sound primal and unyielding. The silver wolf stepped forward, chest heaving, and the pack followed suit, slipping into view from the shadows. A dozen, then more, surrounding the creek bed in a tightening ring. The horses panicked, rearing and snorting, eyes rolling white. Pike clung to his reins, swearing. Dalton cursed and tried to steady his aim, but his hands shook so badly the rifle barrel wavered. Maddox barked, "Hold steady!"
"They're just animals. Fire, and they'll scatter." But even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. The wolves did not flinch from the rifles. Their eyes glowed with a strange intelligence, their movements in unison as though guided by more than instinct. Willa's howl faded, leaving her breathless. She sagged against John, but her lips curved in the faintest, fiercest smile. For a heartbeat, John glimpsed something more than feral survival in her. He glimpsed kinship, a bridge between human and wild. The pack closed in. The silver wolf bared its teeth, a low growl rumbling like distant thunder. Pike's nerve broke first. He fumbled at his saddlebag, desperate to spur his horse away. "Boss, this ain't right. They're not actin' natural." Dalton shouted back, "She's controllin' 'em." His voice cracked with fear. "Devil spawn!" Maddox's gaze snapped to John, hatred blazing. "You brought this on yourself, Carter. Stand aside before they tear you both to pieces." John didn't move. His revolver hung loose at his side, but his stance spoke louder than any bullet. "If they come," he said evenly, "it won't be for her. It'll be for you." The air vibrated with snarls, the line between man and beast thinning with every breath. The standoff had reached its peak. Any spark now would ignite chaos. The standoff shattered with a single crack of gunfire. Dalton pulled the trigger, his rifle roaring as smoke burst from the barrel. The shot went wide, hissing past the silver wolf's flank and splintering the trunk of a cottonwood. The wolves answered with snarls and a surge forward. Shadows leapt from the tree line, teeth flashing, paws pounding the earth. Horses screamed, rearing and twisting as panic spread like wildfire. Pike lost his seat, tumbling into the dirt with a cry, his rifle clattering away. John's revolver cleared leather in a heartbeat. He fired once, the sound sharp and final. Maddox lurched in the saddle, a spray of blood staining his coat. His roar of pain cut through the chaos as he clutched his shoulder, nearly toppling from his horse. "Boss!" Dalton shouted, fumbling to reload, but his hand shook too violently. The wolves swarmed closer, a living tide. Yet, just as the first of them closed the gap, Willa's voice cut through the storm. It was not words, but sounds, low, guttural, threaded with command. Weak as she was, her tone carried authority born of years in the wild. The silver wolf halted mid-spring, ears pricked, eyes fixed on her. One by one, the pack slowed, circling instead of striking, their growls subsiding into a vibrating hum that filled the air. John stood frozen for a moment, revolver still raised, chest heaving with the rush of battle. He had expected to see blood, to watch the wolves tear into the hunters. Instead, the girl's fragile form had checked them, her voice leashing fury with something more primal than chains. Dalton's breath rasped as he stumbled backward, rifle half raised, torn between shooting again or fleeing outright. Pike scrambled to his knees, face pale, eyes wide as he crawled for cover. Maddox, bleeding but upright, glared at John through a haze of pain. "You fool," he spat, his voice raw. "You think you've tamed her. You've unleashed a plague. Those things won't stop with us. They'll come for you, too." John's revolver stayed steady, barrel pointed at Maddox's chest.
"Funny," he said, voice flat. "They don't look like they're coming for me." The silver wolf padded forward, its massive frame brushing against Willa where she leaned weakly against the trunk. It lowered its head, nuzzling her wound with a strange, gentle care, before turning its gaze back on Maddox. The message was clear. She was theirs, and they would not let her fall. For a heartbeat, the world seemed balanced on a knife's edge, violence trembling just short of release. The hunters gasping, the wolves poised, John unyielding, Willa whispering sounds that tethered beasts to will. Then, silence. The chaos had ebbed into a tense stillness. The hunters still lived, but the power no longer belonged to them. The creek bed lay still, broken only by the ragged breathing of men and beasts. Maddox swayed in the saddle, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, the other gripping the reins with white-knuckled fury. His eyes burned across the distance, not with defeat, but with promise, a hatred that refused to die. "You'll regret this, Carter," he snarled, spitting red into the dirt. "This isn't over. You've chosen the wrong side of the line.
Next time, I'll bring enough guns to bury you, the girl, and every wolf in these hills." John kept his revolver level, his stance unshaken. "Then you'd best bring an army." For a long moment, the two men stared at one another, the air between them thick with unfinished war. Finally, Maddox yanked at the reins, turning his horse with a savage jerk. The animal reared, foam flecking its mouth, before lunging away from the wolves' encircling eyes. Dalton hesitated, fear and loyalty warring in his face, then scrambled after him. Pike barely managed to climb back onto his mount, pale as death, his gaze flicking nervously to the tree line, as though the shadows themselves would devour him. Together, they retreated, curses trailing on the wind, until hooves and voices faded into the distance. Only then did John lower his revolver. His arm ached, heavy with the weight of what had just passed. He turned slowly to the girl slumped against the trunk. Her eyes half closed, her skin pale from blood loss, yet relief trembled faintly in her smile. Around them, the wolves remained. The silver alpha padded closer, its eyes gleaming gold in the dim light. It lowered its head to Willa again, brushing its muzzle against her hand. She lifted trembling fingers to its fur, whispering soft, broken sounds that John could not understand, but somehow felt. Sounds of gratitude, of kinship. The wolf's ears flicked, and with a short, commanding bark, the pack began to melt back into the forest. One by one they vanished into shadow, their presence fading like mist at dawn. Only the alpha lingered a moment longer, gaze fixed on John. It was not the look of a beast at a man, but of one protector to another, an acknowledgment. Then it too turned and slipped into the trees. The sudden quiet pressed close, almost unreal after the storm. John exhaled slowly, holstering his weapon. He knelt by Willa's side, gently lifting the cloth at her shoulder to check the wound. Blood still seeped, but the flow had slowed. She would live if he could keep her safe long enough to heal. "You're all right," he murmured, steadying her as her head sagged against him. "It's over now." Her lips moved, the word barely audible but clear. Safe. John's chest tightened. For her, that single word was victory enough. But as he glanced toward the ridge where Maddox had disappeared, he knew the truth. This battle was over, but the war had only begun. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. 3 weeks had passed since the gunfire at the creek. The land bore little trace of the violence now. Grass had grown over the hoofprints, and the waters of the stream ran clear once more. Yet in John's memory, the echoes remained. Maddox's vow, the ring of rifles, the chorus of wolves. Those sounds haunted him like ghosts in the night. Still, not all that lingered was darkness. On the porch of his cabin, he could hear the lighter notes of change, the shuffle of bare feet on wood, the quiet murmur of a girl learning to form words again. "Good morning," Willa said, her voice rough but growing steadier each day. John looked up from the saddle he had been oiling and offered a small smile. "Good morning, Willa." The name still felt new on his tongue. She had given it to him in a whisper during her fever, when he dressed her wound and prayed she would last the night. He spoke it now with respect, as if honoring a sacred trust. Her recovery had been slow but steady. The bullet had only grazed her shoulder, though it left a deep scar. With careful cleaning, poultices made from herbs she herself gathered, and time, the wound closed. Her body, lean and wiry from years in the wild, proved resilient. It was her spirit that amazed John most. Though she often startled at sudden noises or retreated to the edge of the tree line, she returned each day with baskets of berries, herbs, and wild roots. She ate at his table now, though still crouched sometimes out of habit. She had even taken to wearing the simple calico dress he bought from town, though she insisted on going barefoot. And the words, each one was a small miracle. At first only fragments. Water, food, safe. But day by day she strung them together. Patiently, John answered her halting questions, correcting gently, encouraging always. He marveled at her determination. One evening, as the sun burned low across the hills, she sat on the porch steps beside him. In her lap rested a worn basket half filled with sage and wild mint. She touched the scar on her shoulder, then glanced at him. "You, save me," she said, her words halting but clear. John looked away toward the horizon. "I tried," he answered softly, "but truth is, you saved yourself, and the wolves saw to the rest." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "No, you!" She pressed her hand against her chest, then pointed at him. "Safe!" The word struck him, simple yet heavy with meaning. He thought of the scripture that had carried him through the darkest night. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He had walked that valley indeed, but he had not walked it alone. The wolves came sometimes still, their eyes glinting from the tree line at dusk. They never threatened, only watched. Once, the silver alpha stepped close enough for John to see the scars across its muzzle. It bowed its head to Willa before fading back into the shadows. John understood then what few men ever would. She was not abandoned by the wilderness, but embraced by it. The pack was her family as much as bloodkin might have been. And yet she chose to stay here. Each morning she returned from the woods with her small offerings, placing them by the door. Each evening she sat with him, silent or speaking, depending on her courage that day. Slowly, she was learning to walk not only with wolves, but with men. For John, it was a different kind of healing. He had come here to bury the war, to bury the past. He never imagined purpose could be found in another's survival. Yet when he looked at her, scarred but unbroken, he felt a quiet stirring in his own soul. Perhaps the Lord, in His providence, had not brought him here to hide, but to be found. The valley glowed golden beneath the rising sun. From the porch, John watched as mist drifted across the lowlands and the first light touched the distant ridges. It was a sight he had seen countless times, yet it felt different now. The land no longer seemed to him a place of exile. It was home, and it was no longer his alone. Willa emerged from the tree line carrying a bundle of wild herbs and berries, her steps lighter than weeks before. She wore the plain calico dress, her long dark hair loose down her back, but her bare feet still touched the earth as though it belonged to her. "Morning, Peter," she said, the words steadier, her voice rough but strong.
"Mornin', Willa," John answered, a smile creasing his weathered face. She set her basket down and joined him on the porch. For a while they sat in silence, the world around them alive with the calls of meadow larks and the whisper of wind through the oaks. It was not the silence of strangers, but of companions, two souls at rest in each other's company. "The wolves," Willa began softly, eyes turned toward the forest. "They come, sometimes. Watch." John nodded. "I know. They're making sure you're safe." She looked at him then, her gaze clear and thoughtful. "Safe? Here?" She touched her chest, then gestured toward the cabin, the fields, and the wide valley beyond. "Not only with wolves, with you." John swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. He thought of the verse his mother had pressed upon him when he left for war, the one he had nearly forgotten in the smoke and blood. "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." He had seen fear on too many faces, felt it gnaw at his own. But now, looking into Willa's eyes, he saw something stronger, a fragile yet fierce hope. "You've come far, Willa," he said. "From shadows into light." Her lips curved into a rare, unguarded smile. Not alone. They rose together and walked down to the pasture. The old chestnut mare lifted her head as they approached, flicking her tail before returning to the grass. Willa reached out a cautious hand, brushing the horse's mane. She still moved with the instinct of the wild, but she was learning trust one step at a time. As John watched her, he realized his own journey mirrored hers. He too had been lost in shadows, of war, of guilt, of solitude. He had come here to disappear. Instead, God had given him someone to protect, someone who drew him back to life. In the stillness, he prayed silently, a prayer of gratitude and of strength for the days ahead. For though peace filled this valley now, he knew danger still lingered beyond its ridges. Maddox's words haunted him. "This isn't over." And yet, John felt no fear. He had faced the shadow of death and walked through it. If Maddox returned, he would meet him, not as a man hiding from the world, but as one who had found a reason to stand. That night, they shared a simple meal of bread, berries, and venison stew. Willa spoke more than usual, halting but determined, piecing together sentences with a stubborn pride. John listened with patience, sometimes correcting gently, sometimes letting her find her own way. When she laughed, an awkward, startling sound, he found himself laughing too. Later, under the sweep of stars, they sat once more on the porch. The wolves howled faintly in the distance, not in warning but in kinship, a reminder that they were not alone in this wilderness. Willa tilted her head, listening, then closed her eyes. "Family," she whispered.
John looked at her, at the scar on her shoulder, at the resilience in her face. "Yes," he said quietly, "family." The night wrapped around them in a cloak of peace. For the first time in many years, John Carter did not feel alone. And though the road ahead held threats he could not yet see, he knew he would walk it with courage. Not because he sought it, but because Providence had given him someone worth standing for. Stories like this remind us that the frontier was never just about guns and cattle. It was about survival, trust, and the fragile bonds that turned strangers into family.
Perhaps you, too, have known moments when life felt like a wilderness, when hope seemed distant, yet someone's kindness or faith carried you through. That is the spirit of the West, not merely the clash of rifles, but the quiet courage to choose compassion over fear. If this tale touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in mercy, in loyalty, and in second chances. Subscribe and join us as we continue to bring you true Wild West stories, narratives that stir memory, awaken faith, and remind us that even in the loneliest valleys, God plants the seeds of hope. Because the past still speaks, if we're willing to listen.